To speak of the four temperaments in a way that truly serves the path of the soul, we must first free ourselves from the modern habit of treating temperament as a mere psychological label, a convenient classification for social life. What is called temperament is, in truth, a visible gesture of the whole human being, an outwardly perceptible signature of how the soul is weaving itself into the bodily organization. It is therefore not something accidental, nor is it simply inherited in the outer sense. It is connected with the manner in which the human individuality descends from the spiritual world, takes hold of physical, etheric, and astral forces, and sets its own inner rhythm within them. In temperament, we behold, as it were, the way a human being is placed into the world, and at the same time, the way the world is received into the human being. Temperament, when observed rightly, reveals itself as a balance or an imbalance between the forces of thinking, feeling, and willing. Yet it is not enough to speak in generalities, for the soul does not float above the body, it works into it. The child, especially, is not an inner person hidden behind a body, but rather a being in whom body and soul still interpenetrate in a far more immediate way than later in life. When we see a child who is restless, quickly moved, quickly distracted, we are witnessing not a moral fault, but a particular interplay of astral mobility with the etheric forces. When we see a child who is heavy, slow to rouse, but steady once engaged, we are not dealing with laziness. We are witnessing a different relationship between the etheric and the physical organism. The temperaments are, in this sense, windows into the constitution of the human being. But we must go further, for it is precisely in the sphere of temperament that the soul's path becomes visible. The soul is not given temperaments in order to remain imprisoned within them. Temperament is the starting point. Freedom is the goal. The human eye is destined to transform what it finds as a natural predisposition into something it bears consciously. In a certain respect, temperament is the raw material of destiny within earthly life. And the path of education, indeed the path of self-education, consists in guiding the temperament so that it becomes a tool of the I, rather than a master of the I. When Steiner describes the temperaments, he does not do so to create a system for judging people, but to awaken a more delicate perception, above all for those who must educate. One can speak of the sanguine, the choleric, the phlegmatic, and the melancholic, yet these are only names. What matters is the reality behind the names, the living soul gesture. The sanguine soul is drawn outward, captivated by the immediate impression. The world flows in through the senses and immediately kindles inner movement. There is lightness, quickness, and a certain gift for beginning. But the same soul, if left to itself, glides over depths. It risks living in a perpetual morning that never reaches midday. The choleric soul is not simply angry, it is a soul in which willpower presses outward with strength. Such a child can carry fire into the world, can lead, can create. But without guidance, the same force becomes harshness, impatience, tyranny, because the will, untempered by inner listening, seeks to impose itself. The phlegmatic soul is often misunderstood most of all, because it does not display itself with dramatic colors. The phlegmatic soul is not a soul without interest. Rather, interest lives in it differently. It is as though the soul is deeply engaged with the processes of life that others pass over. It holds, it preserves, it endures. It can be faithful, steady, trustworthy. Yet it risks sinking into comfort and repetition, into a dullness that is not peace, but sleep. And the melancholic soul, again, not merely sad, is a soul that experiences weight and gravity in its relation to the world. Such a soul may carry deep seriousness and a capacity for truth, for it is not easily satisfied by superficialities. It seeks what is real, yet it can become imprisoned in itself, as though the world were a burden that cannot be lifted. Now one must grasp something essential. In every temperament there is a hidden gift, and in every temperament there is a particular danger. It is precisely the gift that, if misunderstood, becomes the danger. The sanguine gift of openness becomes dispersion. The choleric gift of strength becomes domination. The phlegmatic gift of steadiness becomes inertia. The melancholic gift of depth becomes self-enclosure. To perceive this is already a step toward a moral attitude. For then we no longer fight the temperament. We work with the gift and rescue it from its danger. Steiner's approach, particularly for education, asks the educator to practice a kind of moral observation. One should not look at a choleric child and say, "This child must be broken." Nor should one look at a melancholic child and say, "This child must be cheered up." These are crude reactions that ignore the soul's lawful path. Instead, one must ask, what does this soul need in order to find balance? What does the temperament need so that it can be led toward freedom? In the background of such questions stands a profound respect for the individuality of the child. The educator is not there to replace the child's I, but to help it become present. This is why Steiner repeatedly points to something that modern pedagogy often overlooks. The temperaments educate one another when they are brought into a living relationship. If children are arranged only according to convenience or external criteria, the class becomes a battlefield of unconscious forces. But if the teacher learns to recognize temperament and to bring temperaments into a meaningful interplay, without labeling, without fixing the child in a type, then something remarkable occurs. The children begin to compensate one another. The sanguine learn steadiness by experiencing phlegmatic calm. The phlegmatic is awakened by the sanguine's brightness. The melancholic is warmed by the choleric's energy, and the choleric is softened by the melancholic's seriousness. This does not happen through moral sermons. It happens through the social organism itself, when it is formed artistically. And this leads us to the deeper point. Temperament is not merely an individual fact. It is a social fact. Human beings do not develop in isolation. The soul unfolds through encounters. Temperament is one of the ways destiny arranges encounters. It is as though life itself brings us those human gestures we need so that we may be educated by the world and so that we may learn gradually to educate ourselves. In the child's life, the teacher becomes the conscious mediator of what destiny otherwise does unconsciously. The teacher must therefore cultivate a quiet inner art, to see the temperament, to honor the gift, to protect against the danger, and to guide the soul toward balance. In the next part, we will go more precisely into how the temperaments relate to the members of the human being, how they appear in the interplay of physical, etheric, and astral forces, and how, through practical educational gestures, one can lead each temperament toward its healthiest transformation. If we now look more closely at the inner structure of the human being, we begin to see how the temperaments arise out of the relationship between the soul and the bodily organization. Steiner emphasizes again and again that the human being is not composed merely of a physical body animated by psychological processes, but of a finely differentiated interplay of physical, etheric, and astral forces, all permeated and gradually taken hold of by the eye. Temperament appears where this interplay does not yet stand in full equilibrium, but reveals a particular emphasis, a dominant gesture. The sanguine temperament arises where the astral body moves with great agility through the etheric organization. Sensory impressions, moods, and experiences are taken up quickly, but they do not remain long. The etheric forces, which are responsible for continuity, memory, and growth, are not yet strongly seized by the astral. As a result, life becomes a sequence of lively moments rather than a coherent inner narrative. From the soul's point of view, this is not a deficiency but a particular stage of incarnation. Such a soul has not yet fully anchored itself in earthly gravity. It still lives close to the periphery of experience. The task here is not to force depth prematurely, but to help the soul discover continuity through gentle repetition, rhythm, and renewed interest in what has already been experienced. In the choleric temperament, by contrast, the astral body grips the physical organization with intensity. The will presses forward, seeking expression and effect. The physical body becomes an instrument of assertion. Here we see a soul that has entered the earthly realm with great force, as though eager to shape its surroundings. This carries enormous potential for leadership, initiative, and courage. Yet the danger lies in the soul becoming identified with its own power. If the will does not learn to listen to reality, to others, to resistance, it risks becoming blind. Education must therefore not oppose the choleric force directly, for this only hardens it. Instead, it must redirect it toward meaningful tasks that demand responsibility, endurance, and service, so that strength learns restraint from within. The phlegmatic temperament reveals a different configuration. Here, the etheric body works strongly into the physical organization, while the astral body remains comparatively withdrawn. Life processes, growth, nourishment, habitual rhythm dominate the soul's experience. Such a human being lives deeply within continuity and repetition. There is a natural capacity for steadiness, loyalty, and quiet observation. But when the astral body does not sufficiently awaken interest, life may become comfortable rather than conscious. The soul risks drifting into passivity. The educational task is therefore to awaken interest, not by pressure or excitement, but by allowing the phlegmatic soul to encounter the living interests of others. What moves another human being can gradually become a bridge to the world. In the melancholic temperament, we encounter a strong inward pull. The physical and etheric organization are experienced as heavy, resistant, even burdensome. The soul feels the weight of incarnation. This often brings seriousness, depth, and a natural orientation toward what is essential rather than superficial. Such souls are often close to questions of meaning and truth. Yet the same gravity can turn inward and become isolation. The melancholic soul may feel misunderstood by the world or may withdraw into itself. Here, education must not attempt to lighten the soul artificially, but to acknowledge its depth and to give it meaningful responsibility. When such a soul feels needed, its gravity becomes strength rather than suffering. Steiner insists that one must never treat these temperaments as fixed categories. In reality, Every human being carries all four within themselves. What we call a temperament is merely the dominant tone at a given stage of life. Moreover, temperaments change. A child who is sanguine may later become melancholic. A choleric youth may mature into a phlegmatic adult. These shifts are not accidents. They reflect the soul's ongoing work of balancing itself. The I gradually learns to take hold of what was once given as nature. This brings us to a crucial point. Temperament belongs primarily to the preconscious layers of the soul. It is strongest in childhood precisely because the I has not yet fully awakened. As the human being matures, temperament should recede into the background, not by suppression, but by transformation. The goal is not to eliminate temperament, but to permeate it with consciousness. When this happens, the gifts of temperament remain, but the dangers lose their power. The former sanguine retains openness without superficiality. The former choleric retains strength without tyranny. The former phlegmatic retains steadiness without inertia. The former melancholic retains depth without self-enclosure. Education, therefore, stands at a threshold. It works with forces that precede freedom, yet it must always have freedom in view. This is why Steiner speaks of pedagogy as an art rather than a technique. No rule can replace the living perception of the child. The teacher must develop an inner mobility that mirrors, in a higher form, the mobility of the temperaments themselves. Only then can the educator avoid the greatest danger, fixing the child in a type and thereby limiting the soul's future path. In this sense, understanding temperament is not a matter of knowledge alone. It is a moral task. It demands patience, self-discipline, and the willingness to observe without judgment. Where such understanding lives, temperament becomes transparent. One begins to see through it, toward the individuality that stands behind it. And this individuality, not the temperament, is the true bearer of destiny. In the next part, we will turn more explicitly to the karmic dimension of temperament and ask how these soul gestures can be understood as echoes of earlier experiences and how the conscious transformation of temperament becomes a step on the path toward freedom. When Steiner speaks of temperament in connection with karma, he invites us to look beyond the boundaries of a single earthly life. Temperament, in this deeper sense, is not merely the outcome of bodily constitution or early environment. It is also an echo of the soul's earlier experiences. The soul does not enter earthly existence as an undefined potential. It brings with it habits of feeling, tendencies of willing, and modes of relating to the world that have been formed over long stretches of time. Temperament can therefore be understood as a kind of memory carried by the soul, one that does not speak in images or concepts, but in gestures of life. From this perspective, a temperament reveals how the soul has learned or not yet learned to relate to earthly conditions. The sanguine soul, for example, often bears traces of a strong orientation toward the outer world in earlier lives. Such a soul has learned to move lightly, to adapt quickly, to meet change without fear. Yet this very capacity may now demand deepening. The karmic task may lie in learning to remain with something, to carry responsibility beyond the moment, to allow experience to ripen inwardly. What appears as superficiality can thus be the starting point for a future capacity for wide understanding if it is guided toward continuity. The choleric soul, on the other hand, often reveals a history of strong will engagement. Such a soul has learned to act, to intervene, to shape circumstances. It brings initiative into life. And this is a precious gift in times when passivity threatens human dignity. Yet karma demands balance. The same force that once created may now need to learn restraint, listening, and cooperation. The choleric temperament thus calls the soul to transform power into responsibility. Only when will is united with moral insight does it become truly human. The phlegmatic temperament may point to a soul that has cultivated continuity, endurance, and a close relationship to the rhythms of life. Such a soul often brings a deep capacity for loyalty and reliability. But karma does not repeat itself. It seeks development. The task now may be to awaken interest, to step more actively into encounter, to allow the world to speak more vividly into the soul. What appears outwardly as indifference may inwardly be a waiting for the right impulse to call the soul into fuller participation. The melancholic temperament often bears the mark of deep inner work in earlier times. Such souls have learned seriousness, reflection, and a capacity to bear suffering. They may be closely connected to questions of truth and meaning, yet karma again demands movement. The soul must learn to step out of inner gravity and into relationship. The task is not to abandon depth, but to allow depth to become a source of strength for others. When the melancholic soul finds a task that is meaningful and socially connected, its heaviness can transform into quiet authority. Steiner emphasizes that these karmic indications are not to be used for speculation or judgment. They are meant to awaken reverence. Every temperament carries a history that deserves respect and a future that depends on how consciously the present is lived. The educator, in particular, stands in a delicate karmic relationship to the child. To misunderstand a temperament is not merely a pedagogical error. It can become a karmic burden imposed upon the child. To recognize and support the path inherent in a temperament can become a karmic help of great significance. This is why Steiner speaks of education as a meeting of destinies. Teacher and child do not encounter one another by chance. The way a teacher responds to a temperament, whether with impatience, fear, or understanding, can strengthen or weaken the child's trust in the world. In this sense, working with temperament is also a form of moral schooling for the adult. One learns to restrain personal preferences, to overcome irritation, and to cultivate a more objective love. Through this effort, the educator's own soul is educated. As a human being grows older, the karmic task connected with temperament becomes increasingly individual. What was once guided from outside must now be taken up inwardly. The adult is called to observe their own temperament and to ask, where does it still rule me unconsciously? Where can I begin to transform it into a conscious instrument? This work is often subtle and demanding. It requires honesty, patience, and a willingness to endure inner tension. Yet it is precisely through this work that the human I gains strength. Steiner points out that freedom does not arise by eliminating predispositions, but by transforming them. Temperament becomes the field in which freedom can be practiced concretely. One learns to pause where one would normally rush, to act where one would normally withdraw, to listen where one would normally dominate. Each such gesture, however small, is a step on the path of the soul. In this light, temperament appears not as a limitation, but as an opportunity. It provides the resistance against which the I can awaken. Without temperament, human life would be flat and undifferentiated. With temperament, it becomes challenging, but also meaningful. The task is not to seek a neutral state, but to bring harmony into diversity. In the final part, we will consider how the conscious balancing of the temperaments leads beyond individual development into social life, and how this balancing becomes a quiet but powerful force in the evolution of humanity. When we finally consider the four temperaments in their full human context, we must see that their true meaning is not exhausted within individual development alone. Steiner makes it clear that the evolution of humanity itself depends on the way human beings learn to balance and transform these soul gestures. What lives in the single human being as temperament lives in humanity as a whole as cultural tendency, historical mood, and social force. The task of the individual soul and the task of humanity mirror one another. In social life, the untransformed temperaments appear in intensified and distorted form. Sanguinity becomes distraction, superficial novelty, and the inability to commit to truth. Choler becomes domination, ideological aggression, and the will to power divorced from moral insight. Phlegm becomes inertia, bureaucratic deadness, and resistance to renewal. Melancholy becomes cynicism, despair, and withdrawal from responsibility. These forces shape institutions, politics, and culture when they are not permeated by conscious individuality. Thus, the work on temperament is never merely personal. It is a contribution to social health. Steiner emphasizes that true social life cannot be built upon uniformity. Attempts to standardize the human being, whether through ideology, technology, or rigid educational systems, inevitably fail because they ignore the lawful diversity of the soul. The four temperaments represent fundamental human possibilities. A healthy society needs all of them, yet it needs them in balance. Initiative without reflection becomes destructive. Steadiness without awakening becomes stagnation. Depth without connection becomes isolation. Openness without responsibility becomes chaos. Social harmony arises not through sameness, but through conscious interplay. This is where the path of the soul becomes explicitly moral. The human I is called to recognize its own temperament, not in order to justify itself, but in order to overcome one-sidedness. Steiner speaks of the middle not as mediocrity, but as a living equilibrium that must be actively achieved again and again. This equilibrium cannot be taught externally. It must be practiced inwardly. Each time a human being restrains an automatic reaction and replaces it with a conscious deed, a small act of freedom is born. The educator, the parent, and ultimately every adult carries responsibility for cultivating such freedom. In childhood, this responsibility is borne largely by the surrounding adults, who create the conditions under which temperament can ripen healthily. In adulthood, it shifts inward. The soul must learn to become its own educator. Steiner sees this self-education as one of the central tasks of the modern age, particularly in the epoch of the consciousness soul. Human beings are increasingly left to themselves inwardly. Guidance from instinct or tradition falls away. What remains is the challenge of conscious self-transformation. In this sense, the temperaments are not relics of an outdated psychology. They are gateways to self-knowledge. They allow the human being to perceive where destiny meets freedom in the most immediate way. One cannot choose one's temperament, but one can choose how to work with it. This choice is repeated daily in small, often unnoticed decisions, whether to listen or interrupt, whether to persist or give up, whether to open oneself to another or retreat into oneself. Through such decisions, temperament gradually becomes transparent to the eye. Steiner also hints that the future evolution of humanity depends on the cultivation of this inner balance. The more external life becomes mechanized and abstract, the more urgent it becomes for human beings to develop inner flexibility, warmth, and moral imagination. The work on temperament strengthens precisely these capacities. It teaches patience without passivity, strength without hardness, openness without dispersion, and depth without heaviness. In this way, the soul prepares itself not only for personal fulfillment, but for participation in a more humane future. Thus, the four temperaments reveal themselves as stages on a path rather than fixed states. They belong to the realm of becoming, not of being. When they are met with understanding, they cease to bind and begin to serve. They become instruments through which the individuality can sound its own tone into the world. The path of the soul, as Steiner describes it, leads not away from temperament, but through it, toward a freedom that does not deny human nature, but transforms it into conscious humanity.